Hello, I'm Bill Botel and welcome to episode 4 of Clocking Corona. Thank you to everyone who's contributed their thoughts and views through the YouTube channel, the Facebook page and on the Twitter feed. I'm tremendously glad and grateful to hear from you. In this episode, I'd like to look more closely at one of the most puzzling failures of the government's initial response to the emergence of coronavirus. And that is the absence of any public awareness and communications campaign about coronavirus as the threat increased during February and March 2020. Now, the need for such a campaign was identified by those who prepared the Australian Health Sector Emergency Response Plan for novel coronavirus. Right there on page 1 of this report, the committee calls for a widespread public communications campaign, yet it never happened. Now, there are 3 good reasons why such a campaign ought to have been undertaken at that time. The first one was the responsibility of the Australian government to Australian travellers in Asia and around the world as they went on holidays in February 2020. We had to tell them that coronavirus was out there and it was changing things dramatically. They had to know what to look out for, how to avoid infection, and if they were infected, what to do to seek care and treatment. Secondly, it was important to begin to take the Australian people on the journey, because it was apparent as February rolled on that more and more drastic measures that upended people's way of lives might have to be taken. It was no use waiting until the last moment in about mid-March to spring all of this on them without warning or without preparing the ground. Thirdly, we needed to have one single source of authoritative information. As the situation deteriorated, people had to know where to go to for the facts. Now, I was involved in the early days of AIDS in Australia, and that was in the days before social media. But I can tell you then, in the early 1980s, we had to deal with a great amount of fear, of disinformation, of panic, and sometimes outright lies about HIV and AIDS. But we provided to the Australian people a single authoritative source of information about the science of HIV and AIDS and about the reasons why we had to take very radical and disruptive measures to combat the threat of HIV and AIDS. We would have had a much better time of it in March and now in April had we established a public information and awareness campaign and run it from February 2020, increasing the volume and the messaging as things deteriorated. As I said, it's a very puzzling omission. I cannot see why it was not undertaken. It was recommended by the officials in this report, and it ought to have been done. Why it wasn't is one of the puzzling mysteries of our response to coronavirus in 2020. As I said, I was involved in the early days of HIV and AIDS, and at that time we developed a very good template of response to that viral attack on Australia. I'd like to compare and contrast the lessons we learned from the time of AIDS and ask the question why they were not applied this year when we had to deal with coronavirus. That's in the next episode of Clocking Corona.